This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 561, entitled, "How will Masculists take over gender politics?" Description. This flyer claims that masculist hatred against the massive gender crimes that women commit against men will be the driving force for masculists' takeover of gender politics. As millions of men become increasingly conscious of the massive, hateable gender crimes that women commit against men, brackets, manslavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, etc., then when men become collectively angry and hateful at women, men will become unstoppable. They will sweep away anything that lies in their path, thus taking over gender politics. Now the flyer itself. How will Masculists take over gender politics? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In a word, with hate, masculist hate at women who commit massive gender crimes against men. As men, in their millions, have their masculist consciousnesses raised, as they become bi-conscious, brackets, that is, have both their masculist and their feminist consciousnesses raised, they will become aware of the massive gender crimes that women commit against men, that is, become hateful of these gender crimes, then exert tremendous moral pressure on women to stop committing these gender crimes or be severely punished by being publicly hated, rejected viscerally, socially, sexually, punished for being hated gender criminals, and cast out of society to die slow, miserable deaths, utterly rejected by masculist men and spat at. At the moment, gender politics is dominated by the feminists, since the feminists have had a monopoly of gender political discourse for the past 6 decades, resulting in feminist ideas being widely spread through the culture, the planet. Most women, and most men for that matter, have been powerfully brainwashed that gender oppression is a one-way street, that it is men who oppress women, and it's women who are the oppressed. From a feminist perspective, this makes sense, since feminism says nothing to women about how women oppress men, since feminism is a solipsistic, gynocentric ideology that takes a very biased gender political view, very one-sided, that completely ignores the other half of the gender political story, that is, the masculist half, that talks about how women oppress men, and in fact that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, given that many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, which makes them far more serious than the rather minor ways that men oppress women. To masculists, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is seen as rather small beer in comparison to women's major gender crimes against men. For example, the big 3 that will be discussed shortly of women's manslavery, women's divorce, rape, and women's forced fathering. Once men are exposed to masculist thinking on the massive injustice of how women oppress men, for example, the big 3 above, then men will develop a sense of burning injustice against these gender criminal women and learn to hate them and feel powerfully motivated to stamp out these massive gender crimes that women commit routinely against men. Thus, the primary weapon that masculists will use to take over gender politics is that of hate, that is, masculist hatred of women who commit these massive injustices against men, who deserve to be hated and punished, severely punished, by effectively being excluded from society, from men, from social acceptance, until they become bi-conscious and see that their massive gender crimes against men are totally unacceptable. And if they are incapable of seeing this, then they will be effectively exterminated by being forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly socially rejected. That is, forced to die a slow, miserable death, hated, rejected, pariahed, totally ignored by men, by masculisted men, as most men become influenced by masculist ideas, which are very powerful and very persuasive, which is not surprising, since they are invented by men who are smarter than women and much more reality-based, much more science-based. Lost my place. Than feminist ideas, which are much more wishful thinking based, preaching to women what women desperately want to hear, that is, that women are as intellectually capable as men, which flies in the face of the scientific evidence, and that men are the oppressors, blaming men for most of women's problems, instead of facing up to the unpleasant fact that most of women's problems are caused by women's inferiorities and inadequacies. The rest of this flyer will spell out the horror of women's gender crimes against men, aiming to generate in men who are not yet familiar with the powerful arguments of the masculists a real hatred coming from millions of men against female gender criminals who commit these monstrous gender crimes against men. I concentrate on the big three that everyone should know about, since they are the most monstrous, the most hate-generating, and that should be the first to be wiped out. I begin with women's man-slavery. To masculists, fluffydom is man-slavery, and man-slavery is slavery, and hence hated and a war issue. A fluffy, based on the word fluff, is a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades. Masculists argue, and this is a very powerful argument, that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based education, hence a life expectancy of 85 years, and so a career window of half a century. So the masculists are now pointing the finger at women, telling them, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is man-slavery that will get you killed." End quote. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on young fluffies to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up. In brackets, FIP equals financially independent person. By getting career competent educations so that they can be FIPs as adults and not expect to manslave a man for decades of his life. Masculists spit at fluffies, rejecting them with hatred because they see fluffydom as manslavery, which masculists hate with a visceral rejection, seeing manslavery as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery, which was the root cause of the US Civil War that cost the lives of over 500,000 US soldiers on both sides. To masculists, manslavery is slavery, hated, and masculists aim to wipe out fluffies by forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable death, utterly rejected by men, masculisted men, who in time will be most men, as the force of masculist arguments penetrates society, the planet, so that millions and later billions of men become strongly influenced by masculist thought. I read that in the UK now, young men think more about the level of fitness of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks, which is a very strong statement. These young men look at these young women with a very cold eye, asking themselves if these young women expect to be able to manslave a man for decades of his life. If he has been influenced by masculinist ideas, he will have an utter contempt, a hatred of fluffies and will reject them viscerally, hatefully, verbally, spitting at such women, totally rejecting them for being manslavers who expect that simply by wiggling their twat at some gullible, ignorant, manslavable man, that she can persuade him to work for her for decades of his life, while she does not bother to fip up and expect to live the life of a parasitic fluffy, a manslaving, hateable bitch. Masculists aim to wipe out such women by placing such powerful moral pressure on them that in time almost no women will dare to be fluffies through fear of being totally rejected by society, certainly by men, which will be catastrophic for fluffies, driving many of them to suicide with no hope for the future, since men will deprive them of a future and will totally reject them, spitting in their faces as manslaving, divorce-raping, hated, fluffy parasites, vermin, fluffies, to be wiped out. Now, for divorce rapists. One father in 4 in many countries today gets divorce raped. That is, he is the victim of the hated, fluffy feminist hypocrite genocider dominated divorce court system, who see men as cash machines to be robbed and abused, who are so hated by the masculists that if a sex war comes, then these fluffy feminists would be one of the first targets by masculist soldiers to be murdered in their thousands, who cause such massive suffering to millions of divorcing men. Why are fluffy feminists so hated by the masculists? Because of their hypocrisy and their genocide. In the 70s, the divorce courts were taken over by the feminists, who wanted equal rights with men in the parliaments that masculists had no problems with, but being monoconscious feminists, they knew nothing about masculism, so by default kept their traditional expectations of men, that is, seeing men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. These traditional views of men by women were taken unquestioned into the divorce courts, so that when a marriage died, the father was expected to remain being the main money earner, so that he continued to pay for the upkeep of the divorced wife and her kids. One father in 4 then got butchered by these hated fluffy feminists, since the divorcing father lost custody of his kids with a probability of 90% in many countries. He lost his house to his ex-wife so that she could raise her kids in it. He was forced to pay for his kids, whom he was barely allowed to see. He lost half his wealth and stuff to her. And if his ex-wife was a real fluffy, he was often forced to pay for her for the rest of his life. This butchery of men in the divorce courts, one father in 4. Thus millions of men, on a daily basis, made the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts truly hated by the masculists. Masculists argue that no culture that butchers a quarter of its fathers can remain intact. Men are feeling such hatred against these fluffy feminists that there is growing talk of a sex war against them, in which they will be murdered in large numbers. One of the many reasons why masculists place such emphasis on the fipping of women is that in a fip society, in which young women are socialised and educated to be fips as much as boys are, then the divorce courts can be based on a principle of financial independence. That is, both divorcing parties, the mother and the father, are assumed to be fips, so that divorcing fathers are not seen by the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as cash machines to pay for women. A fip woman can afford to pay for herself, and the masculists place powerful moral pressure on women to be just that. Otherwise, they will not be able to have a relationship with a masculisted man who will not tolerate a fluffy, utterly rejecting her as vermin. Masculists hate fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy and genocide. Masculists see fluffy feminists as hypocrites because they see these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as wanting equal rights with men in the parliaments, but rejecting equal obligations with men in bothering to share equally the burden of earning the living by bothering to fip up and earning half the cost of living. Thus these fluffy feminists behave as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffy manslaving parasites in the divorce courts. And this hypocrisy makes them hated by the Masculists, who are now so angry and hateful at the daily massacre of one father in 4 that there is growing war talk amongst Masculist soldiers of murdering thousands of these fluffy feminists in a sex war. Masculists have an even greater hatred of the indirect genocide generated by these fluffy feminists, since they have made divorce so toxic for men that they have become indirect genociders, wiping out whole populations, since in many countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, that is, they choose to live the MGTOW lifestyle, MGTOW, men going their own way, of rejecting marriage and paternity, since they absolutely refuse to face a 1 in 4 chance of being butchered in the hated fluffy feminist dominated divorce court system. So these fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders are indirectly wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped, with bullets if necessary, since when populations sense that their very existence is threatened, they often go to war to counter that threat. The fluffy feminist genocide is something that obviously has to be stopped, or we all die out. So masculist theorists put enormous moral pressure on fluffy feminists, seeing them as mass murderers, as population annihilators, and hence as public enemies, and obviously to be hated. And now for those women who force paternity on men, forcing men to pay for 2 decades of his life for a kid he never wanted in the first place. Masculists are burning with injustice